Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Margaret Torn. I'm the outgoing president of the AGU Biogeosciences section. And on behalf of myself and our incoming Biogeosciences president, Colleen Hansel, and newly elected President-elect Emily Bernhardt, I'm just really thrilled to welcome you here to today's Carl Sagan Lecture. The Carl Sagan Lecture is held in honor of the life and career of Carl Sagan. Glasses. And he was, most of you know, I'm sure, but he was a preeminent astronomer and astrophysicist. He was a leader in establishing the field of astrobiology, but he was also a tireless educator, author, and advocate for the space sciences. So this lecture honors his life, but also recognizes a current scientist who embodies Carl Sagan's passion for astrobiology and science communication and education. The lecture is presented every year at the AGU fall meeting, and in even-numbered years, we are able to host it, the Biogeosciences section. And in odd-numbered years, it's sponsored by the Planetary Sciences section. So I hope we have people from both sections here today. So Ariel Anbar is this year's Sagan Lecturer, and he's really a very worthy choice. He's a scientist and educator exploring Earth's past and future as an inhabited world and the prospects for life in other worlds. Ariel and his team have made major contributions to our understanding of Earth over deep time, and especially how the amount of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere and ocean have changed with time. And in good AGU Biogeosciences fashion, the consequences of those changes in oxygen for the evolution of life on Earth, and in the footsteps of Sagan, the application of this knowledge to the search for life on worlds beyond our own. In education, Anbar currently directs the ASU, or Arizona State University Center for Education Through Exploration, which is reinventing digital learning. And I have to say also inventing, it's a little too new to be reinventing. Digital learning around curiosity, exploration, and discovery. And you'll hear about both of those sides, the science, exploration, and education today. Ariel is a highly distinguished recipient. He is a fellow in AGU, Geological Society of America, Geochemical Society, European Association of Geochemistry. He received the Science Innovation Award from the European Association of Geochemistry and the Day Medal from the Geological Society of America. He's also contributed a lot right here to the Biogeosciences section and to AGU as a whole. One thing I want to mention is that he recently spearheaded the Eunice Newton Foote Medal for recognition of achievement in Earth life sciences. It's the first such medal that really brings together those two parts of AGU, and also acknowledges a woman who was the first person to publish documenting the CO2 greenhouse effect, but she is just lesser known. And I guess that will also point to me saying he's a thoughtful and motivated mentor, and was named one of 10 teaching innovators by the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2017. And as much as he is recognized and has accomplished so much in his science, I think his work on education will be an equally important part of Ariel's professional legacy. So what is a little bit more about that scientific work? Oh, I guess I should also tell you that he has a job. He has a day job. He is a professor. He's the president's professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and the School of Molecular Science at Arizona State University, where he directed the Follow the Elements NASA Astrobiology Institute for 8 years. He's also a Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor, and that's in part for his work on calcium and human health studies. So really quite broad suite of work that we are recognizing today. And unfortunately, we won't be able to hear about all of it. As I mentioned, Ariel's talk will be as much about learning innovation as it will be about scientific discovery. Like Sagan, if I can just mention again, Carl Sagan devoted much of his career to educating the public through popular books and creating the Cosmos series and other things. And we'll see some of the innovation that Ariel is doing. So in seeking a Sagan lecturer, I guess we were looking for Ariel. We were looking for someone who was not just a scientist, who could give a great talk about the coevolution of life and geology on planets over deep time. I mean, as if that weren't enough, but someone who could also do justice to Sagan's passion for innovation in STEM education. So Ariel, I appreciate your taking on that broad challenge in today's talk. I just want to say sort of specifically that Ariel is an astrobiology pioneer. He and his students are responsible for unraveling many mysteries about what our planet looked like in the past and how life co-evolved with the changing geochemical landscape. And to do that, he had to develop new measurement techniques and theory and interpretation for elements like lead, molybdenum, and many others. This combines most AGU disciplines, biogeochemistry, geobiology, astrobiology, and the list of discipline expertise kind of goes on. And so that I don't go on, I will just get towards the end. I'd like to end this introduction with a telling statement about Ariel's dedication to science and education. And it's from his nomination letter, which simply states, Ariel recognizes that knowledge is important, but useless if not shared with others. So as the current president of Biogeosciences and president-elect here, it's my honor to invite past president of Biogeosciences to the stage, Ariel Anbar, talk about the science of living worlds. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. Really excited to hear this talk.
Let's get the slides up here. Right. Hey, thank you. That was daunting, humbling. Anytime you are introduced and you hear the word legacy used in your introduction, I think that's a little scary. So thank you for that very gracious introduction. I want to just acknowledge everything you're going to hear about today is, I'm the one here standing, but there are countless students and postdocs and staff and collaborators and colleagues who've influenced everything I'm going to say here. I was originally going to show photographs and thank people specifically, and I thought it's too many and I'm going to forget people. So just thank you to everybody with whom I've worked, and if, to the extent that I've helped influence some of you, I'm grateful for that opportunity. And also, Claire Patterson once said to me that money may be the source of all evil, but it is surely the source of all science. So a thank you to the various funding agencies and philanthropies that have helped support some of this work. That was supposed to be a joke line. You're supposed to laugh when you hear that. There, see, that's good. So I'm no Carl Sagan, but I was, it's humbling. I'm a little bit speechless to be giving a lecture in his honor. Because some of my formative science memories actually tie to Carl Sagan. So I remember when I was in middle school watching Cosmos. Many of you may remember Cosmos, that epic, not the new Cosmos, the original Cosmos that Sagan created, with my father, who was a scientist. And this is one of my earliest memories thinking and talking about science, because I remember my father grousing a little bit. He was also interested in the origin of life, grousing a little bit about, Sagan saying certain things were fact that were still kind of a matter of debate. And so it was both eye-opening to learn about science from Sagan through Cosmos, but then also to see this other aspect of science that I think we all as practicing scientists know very well, that nothing is ever settled, right? There are things to argue and debate about, that the arguing and debating and trying to figure out what's what is at the heart of what science is. It's not just a body of knowledge. And so that came about through this interaction around Cosmos. And it's, like I said, it's one of my formative memories around science. I picked this picture in particular because it shows Sagan doing what, we think of him as a great scientist and orator, but he was a teacher, right? He was a teacher. His science popularization grew out of him wanting to teach people, to educate everybody about the planet, about our place in the universe, about hopeful futures and daunting challenges. And so I've been inspired by that all my career. And part of what I hope to accomplish here is for younger people looking at this, early career scientists, wondering how much time to put into research versus education. I want to try to sort of spark that seed that, putting time into teaching, into education, into outreach is important. Finding a way to do that and balance your research is, of course, very important, but don't put it totally on the back burner. And to the extent I can be any kind of example in any way following in Carl's footsteps, that's what I would hope to be an example of. This talk is going to be, well, first of all, it's probably going to be too long, but I'm going to try to make sure I'm efficient here. And I saw there's nothing scheduled after us, so I can go long. And if you have to leave, I won't be offended. But this talk is going to be in two parts. It's going to try to cover a couple different things. There are two facets of what interested Sagan and interests me as well. And they're kind of embodied in these two books that he wrote kind of late in his career in the mid-90s, just a couple of years apart from each other. The book on the left, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space, is a book that it's sort of a meditation and an exposition on humanity's place in the cosmos. It's a book about astrobiology. It's a book about where we stand in the universe and how we know that. It's really a guiding text, informal text in the world of astrobiology. The one on the right, The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark, is a book that he wrote a couple of years later that is really focusing on the Anthropocene. Before that word even existed, right? The word Anthropocene didn't exist in 1996, I think, when that book was written. But he was really dwelling on what's the future of human civilization and what's the role of science and scientific thinking in advancing, preserving, and securing our future. So those two sides, astrobiology and the Anthropocene, are embodied in those books. They're embodied in probably part of it because of those books in what I think about a lot. And they're embodied in this talk, in the two parts of this talk. And what I'd like to assert for you, and this is, kind of bold, but, when you're asked to give the Sagan lecture, you go bold or you go home. So, astrobiology and the Anthropocene, these are not disconnected things. There is a strong overlap between them. And I'd assert to you that the overlap is a kind of emerging science, which I'm calling a science of living worlds, right? The science of how that sort of tackles the question of how do living worlds evolve as holistic, integrated entities, right? Once upon a time when I was undergrad, we learned about, well, there's the planet and it kind of evolves, and there's life that's kind of on it and it kind of evolves. And then it became this radical new thing to talk about the coevolution of the planet and life. And we still talk about coevolution, but that's kind of an old framing now, right? I mean, really, the more we see it, it's an integrated, holistic system, the planet and life. A living planet is a different thing from a planet that doesn't have life in ways that we're still learning about. And so I think there's a science there that's emerging. And it's a science that, if we really think about it holistically, has to include us, because we're part of the living planet. We're part of the planet's life. People have talked almost poetically, but I think there's truth to it, that we are the planet and the universe coming to know itself in some way. This rise of consciousness is a thing that is coupled to the planet. It's not like some religious thing bestowed upon it. And so we need to be thinking somehow in holistic terms. And it's very hard to define what this science is, like most sciences when they're born, I think. But there's something there that is a coherent whole. Now, astrobiologists really care about this science of living worlds, because astrobiologists want to know what we're looking for. We're looking at worlds beyond our own and looking for evidence of life. What are we looking for? And so we need to understand the way the living planet looks and operates and functions throughout its life cycle, right? Most of the planets we're going to be looking at are not going to be like Earth is just now. They're going to be like it was billions of years ago, or maybe a billion years in the future. So what does that look like? So understanding how a living planet evolves becomes kind of key if you want to approach astrobiology really scientifically. And then if we're dealing about the Anthropocene, of course, we're very interested in the future evolution of this world, right? So we're interested in how this planet is going to evolve going forward. And as a geoscientist, I kind of came to this sobering realization that, you guys have probably all realized this too in various ways. But at about 15, 20 years ago, it kind of suddenly dawned on me that, as a geoscientist, I can't talk about the future of the planet anymore. I can't tell somebody what the planet's going to be like in 100 years or 1,000 years, or probably even 100,000 years. Hopefully, frankly, even 1,000,000 years, without thinking about what is the role and future of human civilization, because we have such a profound impact that's only likely to grow over time. So that's part of an evolving world, right? An evolving living planet is partly us and our future. So if you're dealing with Anthropocene, you also want to understand the science of living worlds in a forward kind of way to get something predictive. So this is obviously an incredibly, perhaps pathologically integrated science. Right, it begins with, of course, the biosphere and life sciences and the intersection of life sciences with geoscience, but intersecting in deeper ways that we normally think about. Biogeosciences usually deals with, the intersection with the Earth's crust, but there are ways in which, if we really want to understand how a living world evolves, we need to think about the integration all the way to the core. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into this. And then going forward, we need to be thinking about the integration with what we might call the anthrosphere, right? We have the biosphere, the geosphere, we have the anthrosphere, the human civilization part of the planet, which brings in social sciences, not as an add-on, not as an extra, but as in some way, an integral part of thinking about the future of the planet. And humanities comes into play too, because at the end of the day, at least for humans, right, when we decide what to do, it's shaped by our values, right? And so humanities becomes actually part of this as well. On some alien world with alien intelligence, so I guess we wouldn't call it humanities in that case. Although we do talk about, Martian geology, and geo means Earth, so maybe we'll talk about humanities from Alpha Centauri when we discover intelligent beings there. But they'll have their values of some sort, right, that shape their behavior in some way. And so, so even if there's intelligent life elsewhere, the same kind of thing applies. Understanding what motivates is going to be kind of critical. So it's not just the science; it's also the beyond science aspects. So integrating all this is what we need to try to figure out how to do. It's very hard. There's no roadmap for this. There's no textbook. The table of contents for the textbook of the Science of Living Worlds is a big question mark. And so what I hope to do now in the next 40 minutes or so is to sort of delve into a couple of possible chapters in a slight order. I'm not being systematic about this because this, as I said, this book doesn't exist, but I want to kind of dive into a couple of areas that I think are important and interesting, and will hopefully leave you with some interesting thoughts of your own, and hopefully inspire or. So part one of this talk, let's dive into. I don't know what chapter number this is. It's an early chapter. How rare is our world? How rare is this world? And I want to draw some lessons from ancient Earth. In some ways that I haven't seen done quite this way before. This is a beautiful picture of Earthrise from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's my favorite Earthrise picture. It's fairly new and recent, not super new, but in the last 10 years or so. It's just lovely. It makes you think about how rare is this planet. Now, astrobiologists, of course, are very interested in this because this is a picture of the Earth. You were all in this picture as well in 2013. This is Earth taken from the Cassini orbiter around Saturn. And what astrobiologists want to do is find out if there are other worlds like this, other pale blue dots, to use Carl Sagan's very poetic phrase, other pale blue dots out there. So it's very natural when you start thinking about astrobiology to start asking, well, how rare are we? Because that's really what motivates the search in many ways. And we live at this remarkable time. I mean, the reason it's worth dwelling on this chapter in particular is because we live at this remarkable moment. This is James Webb Space Telescope image from just earlier this year. This is a direct image of an exoplanet. The spot here is in different wavelength bands. A planet orbiting a star. The star's light has been blocked out to make the planet visible, but the star is where the star is. So we're now living in an epoch where we actually can start to directly image exoplanets. Now, this is a gas giant. It's nothing close to an Earth-like planet. We're a long way from anything like this from an Earth-like planet. But when I was a graduate student, which I don't feel like was all that long ago, the notion that this would ever happen, that we'd get this kind of data, was science fiction. It was almost science fantasy. When I was a graduate student, if you said you were going to go look for exoplanets as your thing, you were looked at a little strange, like, is that really going to be a thing? Is that going to be possible? Well, it is possible. We now know of thousands of confirmed exoplanets, 5,200 confirmed, and that's a drop in the bucket. What we're finding from this is that pretty much all stars have planets. When I was an undergrad and graduate student, that was a hypothesis. We didn't know. Now we know incontrovertibly there's planets everywhere. And terrestrial planets, rocky worlds, are not particularly rare either. So in this sample of roughly 5,000, there are roughly 200 terrestrial worlds. And then there are these interesting super Earths. So rocky worlds are not rare. And so we want to try to understand how life might work on these worlds and how we might detect it. Likely, none of these worlds are exactly like the Earth in all their particulars, and probably different from Earth in all sorts of particulars that are important that we don't quite even understand yet. And so developing a kind of a science of how living worlds evolve, as opposed to a just so story, which is what we have for Earth, is going to be kind of important to actually understand what we're even looking for. So let me dive into that. Let's go a little bit more in depth there. What do I mean by that? So first of all, some very smart folks have thought for quite a while. I've asked this question about how rare is our world. This is a really thought-provoking book written over 20 years ago now by Peter Ward and Don Brownlee. The rare Earth hypothesis: why complex life is uncommon in the universe. And their thesis is that life may well be common, but they argue that the conditions that led to complex life emerging on Earth are unusual. And so they argue that complex life is probably kind of rare. It's a provocative thesis. They cover a lot of ground. They think about a lot of different dimensions to that question. But there's one that they don't think about, which is what I want to dive into here, is how rare are aerobic biospheres? So they don't really deal with this. And I think we now have some interesting new knowledge coming along that sheds new light on this in an exoplanet context. How rare are aerobic biospheres? So, because when we think about the Earth, when you and I think about what makes the Earth special, the fact that we have air that we can breathe that, supports an aerobic biosphere is kind of fundamental to Earth as we know it and love it, right? And so how rare is that? How rare is that? So, of course, the first thoughts around that go to photosynthesis, right? We know that oxygen is produced by biology. This is a beautiful, lovely picture of an oxygen bubble emerging from a cyanobacterial mat. So this is, photosynthesis. The way a geochemist thinks about photosynthesis is CO2 plus water makes O2 plus CH2O. The stoichiometry is right, good enough for most of us as geochemists, planetary scale geochemists. And I know that's not really that's the equation, but you all in this audience understand this. So oxygen is produced by biology, and so it's very tempting, and you certainly see textbooks, and there's very smart people who subscribe to this notion still, that the rise of an aerobic biosphere is all about the origin of oxygenic photosynthesis. That's the story. That oxygen producing photosynthesis evolved, and that takes over the planet, which makes it then very hard to think systematically about it, because that's like predicting evolution on another world is like biological evolution on another world is very hard to do, right? So it becomes this almost quasi-magical thing when we think about whether or not there's aerobic biospheres elsewhere. So here's history of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere from 4 billion years ago to today. And I apologize, I'm going to have some other figures where the time axis gets swapped around. We geoscientists are really bad about being inconsistent with that. So I apologize in advance. Just pay attention to where the 4 is. That's ancient. So this is a long time ago. This is today. For roughly half Earth history, we know that there was very little oxygen in the environment. About 2.3 billion years ago, we had what was referred to as the Great Oxidation Event. When oxygen rose to, it crossed a very low threshold, but rose to something that at least started to leave its imprint very persistently in the geologic record, and never seems to have really gone back again, and eventually made its way to the 20%, 21% that we have today. So one notion is that this is the time when oxygen-producing photosynthesis emerged on the planet, and it took over. And as I said, it becomes this almost quasi-magical thing to wonder, would this happen on another world? Well, I don't know, maybe, you got to have certain conditions, but predicting the timing of that would be next to impossible. But a lot of us have been looking, scratching, probing the earlier geologic record in the last 10, 15, 20 years to look for evidence of oxygen production before the Great Oxidation Event. Because we know from fossil evidence that there were photosynthetic organisms before. We have cyanobacterial mats, and the textures in there clearly show phototaxis. And you can at least make an argument, even just from the morphologies there. Tanya Bosak has made this argument at MIT that these were oxygen-producing mats, and they go back, to 3 billion years ago or earlier. So many of us geochemists have been scratching around and trying to come up with new analytical methods to try to figure out if we can see evidence of oxygen, and we think we do. Not large amounts of oxygen, because it was a broadly anaerobic world. But and this is too complex a figure to go into. And I'm going to show a few figures along the way that I know are too complex to go into in a talk like this. But this is being recorded. You've got the reference. If you're interested, you can go look. But I'm going to give you the bottom line message. What you're seeing here we've gone to 2.5 billion years ago, about 100 to 200 million years before the Great Oxidation Event, and we've done sort of this exquisite high-resolution geochemistry for a whole bunch of proxies. We being, myself doing some of the initial work, but then lots of other people have been involved in different aspects of this. And what we find in black shales from this 2.5 billion years of time is we see these excursions in redox-sensitive metals like molybdenum enrichments. We see perturbations in all sorts of isotope systems, each of which one can interpret in more than one way. But if you want to come up with one single interpretation of all these changes, The most parsimonious one, at least most of us who really work in this believe or conclude, is that there were small amounts of oxygen in the environment being produced, presumably biologically, during this time before the Great Oxidation event. And numerous workers then have dug earlier in time, looked for evidence of oxygen earlier, and also have done work on phylogenetic work to try to reconstruct, try to pin down a little bit when, as best you can from those kind of records, when oxygen emerged. And there's a picture that is evolving, but I would say solidifying among a large part of the community, that there's evidence of what we refer to as whiffs of oxygen in the geologic record well before the Great Oxidation event. And the most parsimonious explanation that those of us who study this offer is that this is probably evidence of biological production of oxygen in the environment, hundreds of millions of years, perhaps up to 1 billion years before oxygen takes over the environment with the Great Oxidation event. And I want to say that there is argument about this. There's no time here, and we'd get very technical to go into the nuances of it. So there are those who disagree with this picture. Happy to discuss that. There's lively debate in the literature. As I said, I learned from Carl watching Cosmos and hearing my dad talk about it, that's part of science, and that's great. But this picture is, I think, time will prove, is pretty solid. That oxygen was being produced in the environment long before the Great Oxidation event. So then, what kept it down? Why wasn't there a Great Oxidation event back here 3 billion years ago? Why did it happen 2.3 billion years ago? So we need to think about the sinks, right? I mean, you got sources, but you also got sinks, right? I mean, this is geochemistry, right? So the sinks matter too. So what about the sinks for oxygen, the long-term geological sinks? Well, there are things like continental weathering, reaction with volcanic gases, submarine gases, subaerial gases, right? All these things that are essentially mantle derived. It's interactions with the solid planet. Right? Biology is producing oxygen. The solid planet, in various ways, is taking it away. Slowly, on a short time scales, what takes away oxygen is respiration, right? But on long geological periods of time, it's these geological processes, geological reactions with solid earth materials, which just makes sense, because if you think about the Earth's interior, right, the Earth's interior is essentially an infinite sink for oxygen at the level of that we're talking about at the Earth's surface, right? The mantle is quite reduced. The core is solid iron, right? We are a thin veneer of oxidized material sitting on top of essentially an infinite sink. And so it just makes sense. Like if you just step back and think about it like a physicist, well, of course, the oxygen level at the Earth's surface is going to depend in some way on the rate at which the surface interacts with that interior. That's going to be just absolutely fundamental to governing, to what extent you can oxidize that surface layer and how persistently. So it's a balance between sources and sinks, right? Biology produces, geology taketh away. At least in terms of oxygen long-term balance in the environment. Biosources versus geosinks. There are nuances to this that we can get into. This is a very high-level talk, but at a high level, this is the way it seems to be. And when we talk about trying to define a science of living worlds and think about exoplanets, this is where we have to start, not in the details, but in the broad picture. So you may ask, okay, so is there, if I'm arguing that the sources have been around for a long time, am I suggesting that the sink has somehow changed? Was the redox state of volcanic gases more reducing early in Earth history and became less reducing as time went forward? And yes, I am suggesting that. And there's really exciting new research that I've been privileged to be a part of, but I'm by no means an expert about that suggests, in fact, exactly that. So this is from a recent paper in Science Advances just this past year by O'Neill and Albach, summarizing some work by Albach and Stanyo, and Willie Nicholas, who was part of a research project that I helped lead a bit before that. What you're seeing here, and I apologize for the complexity of this, especially for people who are more bio, because this is a very solid Earth kind of a story here. What you're seeing here is time, and there's 4 billion years ago is here now. This is where I switched the axis on you. So this is a long time ago. This is today. This is oxygen fugacity. It's essentially a measure of the redox potential of the mantle source region for volcanic gases from a couple different lines of evidence. And so as you go up here, the situation is more oxidized. And what's seen in these data that's drawn from komatiites and basalts through time is that there seems to have been a secular increase in the oxygen fugacity of the mantle source region for volcanic gases and crust formation, et cetera, in the run-up to the Great Oxidation event. You might say, well, maybe that's biological oxygen that's being subducted down and oxidizing the mantle, and the mass balance doesn't work. It's not that, right? This is something integral to the mantle or to the Earth's interior that's happening, it appears, that was gradually increasing the redox potential, the oxygen fugacity of what was coming out. The sink strength was changing. Again, you can argue about this, and there are solid Earth scientists who will argue about it, like everything in science is contentious, but this is a reasonable interpretation. And I think, again, over time, this is going to hold up quite nicely. So what this means, right, is that what they also note here is that, here's the great oxidation event right around here. If you do mass balance modeling, which of the atmosphere and how it's interacting with the mantle, which there's no time to go into in this presentation, what you come up with is that this shift in redox of volcanic gases is adequate to explain a tipping point from a net reducing to net oxidizing atmosphere around 2.5 billion years ago. The timing and the intensity of change is about right. So one can at least construct a pretty plausible scenario that the rise of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, the timing of that is not about the origin of photosynthesis. That was a necessary condition, but not sufficient. It's the intersection of the origin of photosynthesis and the evolution of mantle redox such that the balance between source and sink crosses a tipping point around 2.3 billion years ago. It's a hypothesis. I mean, I can't prove it to you, but it was a hypothesis that was not viable until recently. These new data suggest it is quite viable and interesting. Why might that be? What's going on inside the mantle? Well, O'Neill and Albach offer a suggestion here. So they argue that during early Earth history, shortly after core formation, you form a layer deep in the mantle of iron 3+, so oxidized iron-bearing bridgemanite, which it comes about because of disproportionation of iron oxide when you're making the core. And this relatively oxidized material is of a density that's such that it takes a while for it to mix into the bulk mantle. So the early mantle is kind of redox segregated with the oxidized layer near the core mantle boundary. And over time, that oxidized material mixes into the rest of the mantle, making the oxygen fugacity of mantle gases increase over time until you cross this tipping point. And they did some geodynamic modeling to show again that this is plausible. So this is what I was getting at when I was saying that, if you really want to understand the rise of an aerobic biosphere, it's not enough just to think about the biology. You've got to think about the solid Earth. And in fact, you probably have to think about the solid Earth all the way down to the core mantle boundary and the process of core formation. These things all interact and tie together. A science of living worlds has to begin with that recognition that it's an integral thing, that what we see at the surface that we care about is the result of an integrated process that ties the whole planet together. From an exoplanet standpoint, this becomes very interesting. So let's imagine two worlds. There's Earth on the left and some hypothetical exoplanet on the right. That exoplanet is not identical to the Earth. It might have a different mass. In this particular cartoon, it's a little bit bigger. It might have different dynamics because of, for example, a slightly different magnesium to silicon ratio, which leads to different dynamics of the mantle, different mantle mixing dynamics. Could have a different volatile inventory. What controls the volatile inventory of planets when they form? That's an area of active research. Different redox budget, right? Different ratio of carbon to oxygen or other redox controlling elements in that world. So what are the effects of those differences on the timing of the rise of oxygen on a hypothetical exoplanet where biology has emerged, biological oxygen production has emerged, but the solid Earth has to, get its act together in sync in order for oxygen to rise? How do these things affect things? Or another way to put it is, if the Earth was 5% more massive, how would that mantle story that I just told you have changed? If the Earth's magnesium to silicon ratio were 10% different, how would this story be different? And the answer is we don't know, right? Because we actually don't have a predictive science of this. We kind of have pieces of it, and some people have started to, get beyond hand waving around this. But this is an area of active research, so that is just starting to happen. So it's an example, I think, of this science of living worlds, what I'm calling that, giving rise to sort of new research directions as we try to understand how we go from telling just so stories about Earth's history to try to understand scientifically in a way that gives us some predictive ability. Well, what happened? How did that trajectory happen? If we understood it as a science, then we could answer these questions about, well, what happens if we tweak certain variables? We don't understand that as a science. We understand it as just so stories. So we need to get beyond that. So that's one sort of call to arms. And it may well turn out that as we dig into this, right, it may well turn out that because we know that element abundances, for example, are different for different stars, and we know that translates into planets, and that probably translates into different carbon to oxygen ratios. It may well turn out that Earth as an aerobic planet, that having an aerobic biosphere is a rare thing, right? Maybe most planets actually, even when they evolve oxygen photosynthesis, don't actually get to have an aerobic biosphere because the mantle doesn't evolve the right way or in the same timeline as Earth did. So we need to understand this. If those kind of questions interest you, and we're gonna get to the Anthropocene part here in a second, but if those kind of questions interest you, a plug here for LIFE. This is a research coordination network that a group of us are getting started under the auspices of the NASA astrobiology program. This is a community-wide effort to bring together the research community, not just the NASA-funded research community, around trying to understand the integrated evolution of living worlds. Fundamentally, that's really what this group is all about. So if this interests you, go to lifercn.org and sign up to be on the email list. So now I want to turn to the other chapter. Again, I don't know where this one is, but it's much later in the book for sure. Can we manage Earth's future? And I'm going to draw lessons from learning science. And you'll see why I'm just talking about learning science in just a minute. So first of all, the notion of managing Earth's future, that phrase is contentious. It used to be more contentious 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was much more contentious than it is now. I just want to show a figure that has sort of galvanized my thinking around this. I sat back at one point and asked, okay, is it hubris to think that humanity's impact on the planet is such that we need to think about us managing the planet somehow, or not, right? And so I started thinking in terms of energy, right? And so I made up this chart, and now we're trying to write a paper on this with a graduate student who's working with me. So total world energy use on the x-axis in exajoules per year, and year on the y-axis, and this is looking at industrial energy use. And so historical records are pretty good. So we know historically what the trajectory has been of energy use. And that right away is kind of sobering, right? We are right now using energy at a rate that is comparable to about 10% of the rate of energy capture, of sunlight by land photosynthesis. Let me just stop there, just to think about that for a second, right? So you've got all the terrestrial biosphere on the planet capturing sunlight, doing its photosynthetic thing that represents a certain amount of energy. Take all the energy that human civilization is right now generating, largely from burning dead plants, and that's about 10%. That's huge, right? That's a huge percentage. Project forward, and there's different ways you can project, right? You can do the fun and dumb thing of just fitting an exponential, because it has been exponential. So let's just keep on going. You can try to do something more sophisticated and look at per capita. You look at population growth and look at per capita energy use and how it has changed over time, and try to combine those things and try to make projections. And that actually gets you super exponential. Or you can maybe say, well, developed countries like the United States and Europe have slowed their energy use. We use less energy per unit GDP. We become more energy efficient. So what if developing countries, follow the same trajectory as we do? Well, then you get a slightly more moderate thing, this efficiency curve. It's still a big number, right? There's like no way we can do these projections and imagine a world of 11 billion people in the year 2100, which is kind of where steady state supposedly is, according to demographers. There's no way you get to 11 billion people living at kind of developed world standards without using fearsome amounts of energy. And what I would assert to you is, it doesn't matter how you get that energy. I mean, it matters. I mean, it's stupid to be doing it with the fossil fuels because then you're screwing up the atmosphere. But no matter what you're doing, go all to alternative energies. It doesn't matter. If we're using that much energy, we're changing the face of the planet in all sorts of ways, because we're using that energy to do stuff. We're using that energy to shape our environment. That's why we're doing it. So we're not sitting out here in the cold in Chicago, right? So we can have this nice conference here, and so on and so forth, right? So there's no way we aren't shaping the planet. And so it seems to me that it's inevitable, to borrow a phrase from my friend David Grinspoon, who gave one of these lectures a few years ago. Earth is very much in human hands. Assuming that we don't, extinguish ourselves somehow, assuming that we at least muddle along, let alone thrive, we are facing a future where the planetary future depends strongly on us, even once we solve the climate problem, which we will, right? We will eventually muddle our way through to a solution to that. But that's not the end of it. I mean, the folks in the room here are biogeoscientists, know that we're altering the nitrogen cycle more profoundly than the carbon cycle, right? The carbon cycle just is the poster child because it affects climate, which everybody perceives. And there are so many other things. You know, we're moving so much material at the Earth's surface now that we are exceeding geological forces just in mass transfer at the surface of the planet. And these things are only going to accelerate. So the planet is very much in human hands. So when we think then about the future of this world, we need a planet of problem solvers. We are going to be facing challenges of a sort that humanity has never faced, and civilization has never faced. So there's no rule book to go by. We've got to figure things out. We need to be solving problems in creative and intelligent ways. Sagan said this very nicely. You know, we're in very bad trouble if we don't understand the planet we're trying to save. These problem solvers need to understand this world and how it works, which means what we're really talking about is education. And this is kind of how I came about to starting to put a large part of my career into education and education innovation. You know, I'm a geoscientist. I study the Earth's past. I'm interested in life elsewhere. And I started thinking about Earth's future and realizing I can't even think about Earth's future without understanding humans. And it's like, okay, so that's really all about education. That's what determines what people decide they're going to do in their lives when they're adults, right? It's education writ large, right? Not just formal education. So really, you know, we could start thinking about the education system as a vital Earth system. Pause there too. Just think about that for a second. How we educate, you know, our young, intelligent humans is a system, whatever it is. It's a dysfunctional, chaotic, very fractured system right now, but is a system. And it is a system that is as vital to Earth's future as any other. And so, in a sense, is a subject of study that we should be taking as seriously as any other area of Earth sciences. So what I've started doing, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a few minutes, is getting big into digital innovation, figuring out how we can use technology to improve the way we teach science. And we have this mantra, so I run the Center for Education through Exploration at ASU. You can go to the website if you want to learn more about it. And we're trying to transform learning to embrace exploration of the unknown, not just mastery of what's known. And I want to explain here why. By the end of this, you'll understand why we're using that framing. In delving into this and going into the education world, you know, I started learning a lot about learning science and learning engineering, which are new emerging areas themselves, kind of like biogeosciences. And so there are interesting lessons that emerged that I want to share with you, right? Because this is a geoscience audience, right? I don't know, how do you feel here from the education section? Anybody? Few, maybe? Yeah. One back there, right? So most of you don't think a lot about learning probably as a formal area of study. And so what I want to impart to you is that this is an emerging, really interesting area of study that is bringing us interesting lessons that we need to internalize as scientists who care about the future, who care about education in some broad way, even if we're not, you know, teachers per se, many of us. So learning sciences, first of all, what is it? It is itself this very integrative, cross-disciplinary thing. Linguistics, neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science, et cetera. These things all work together to become what learning sciences is. It's a bit squishy, kind of like biogeosciences is a bit squishy. What is biogeosciences exactly? It's a little hard to define, right? So similarly, learning sciences, it's a little hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. And it's this integration of a bunch of different things that all have long histories that are kind of coming together in certain ways. Learning engineering, and this is, you know, don't study this diagram. This is just to show you, we can take learning sciences can help us take teaching practice and analyze it, taxonomize it, and study it to try to figure out how we can engineer our teaching, how we can treat our teaching like an engineer treats a system to try to optimize it for certain outcomes. All right, so this is a great paper by Ken Kadinger on structural complexity and the science to constrain it in Science about 10 years ago. Trying to sort of show that we're at this point where we can start to analyze human learning in quantitative ways, and we can try to get to best practices, treating this as a science and engineering discipline. So some things that emerge from learning science and engineering that are worth paying attention to. These are like some highlights to me as a non-learning scientist, as a geoscientist, teaching practitioner, right? So one of them, this is something I think everybody, if you teach at all, you've heard about this already, right? Active learning, right? That active learning is far superior to passive learning. What I'm doing right now, what you're doing right now, trying to learn from me, talking to you, this is like one of the worst forms of teaching, right? Maybe it works for an hour, but even Carl Sagan, who was one of the great orators ever, right? I bet by week 12, his class was sick and tired of his teaching style, right? Because you tune out. It's inevitable. if you're interested at all in this, there's a special issue of Nature with this very nice feature talking about in making very accessible this PNAS paper that's summarized below, that's mentioned below, about the science of teaching science. It has this great pull quote. We know enough now about the power of active learning, at least when it's done well, that at this point it's unethical to teach any other way. That's maybe a little strong. But it's with the notion of like drug trials, right? So when you're doing a drug trial and you find an intervention that you see works and heals patients, it's considered unethical to continue just studying it. You've got to give everybody that drug, right? If you have clear evidence that it works. So similarly, active learning, at least when it's implemented well, we know works really well. And so if you're teaching, if you're at all involved in this, you want to be figuring out how to do it well. And Sagan understood this. I think we all as scientists understand this. So before the phrase active learning was even kind of around, Sagan has this line in one of his books, when you make the finding yourself, even if you're the last person on earth to see the light, you'll never forget it. Right? If you're a learning scientist or a cognitive science, you've heard this term constructivism, constructing your own knowledge, right? That's the most powerful sort of learning, right? We all know this as scientists. That's what active learning tries to do. So we want to try to implement sort of these kind of discover for yourself approaches. Something else that emerges very recently from learning science, this is a very accessible article too, closing achievement gaps in MOOCs. So we all hear about massively open online courses. I don't know what you think about them. If nothing else, they provide lots of data and they become experimental systems in ways that they're difficult to study things that are difficult to access otherwise. So this is dealing with inclusion. I realize this is a very busy slide. I'll try to give you the highlight here. And again, the paper is very accessible. This is looking at success, persistence, and success, completion in MOOCs at a scale of thousands of students, comparing students from more and less developed countries. And well known in these MOOCs that, here's the control, that there's this global gap, that the students from more developed countries persist more than from the less developed countries, and also complete at higher rates. And in this study, the hypothesis was that the reason for that gap is because of what's called identity threat. So identity threat, if you've heard of imposter syndrome, which probably at this point most people have, these are closely related, right? It's the idea that if you are in a space and you have fear, you have anxiety because you feel you're less capable, right? You're part of a group that is somehow less capable, you think, right? You believe that, you internalize that, it actually impairs learning and leads to inequitable outcomes. And so the hypothesis was that with some simple interventions, perhaps that could be addressed. And so in this study, they did a couple of simple interventions. One was the social belonging intervention is an intervention to basically expose students early in the course to testimonials from others like them who had completed the course in order to give them a sense that, yeah, you can do this. You're not out of place here. You belong here, right? So this is kind of representational thing. And then another intervention was affirmation. So basically get students to reflect on why they're in the course. What are their values that are leading them to be in this course? Because there was some research showing that if you get students to be self-reflective about why they're doing something, they'll be more persistent at it. And indeed, so you see these interventions were done and you see this gap closes. And this is because you're doing this technologically with MOOCs, it becomes a replicable thing. You can treat this like science, right? They replicated it. Look at it, look at persistence, look at completion. And so one of the things that emerges then is, you don't have to, with very simple interventions, actually, you can make a big difference in inclusion. That's kind of an important, powerful thing to come out with. We kind of all know this from our daily lives, right? You had that one influence that really shaped your ability to think that, oh, I could do something, right? Well, so do that in your teaching. This is unpublished work that I just find fascinating and in all sorts of ways. This is by Ken Kadinger, a learning scientist at Carnegie Mellon University. So this will hopefully be coming out soon. And he gave me permission to share this. So this is a little complex, but once you grasp it, you get it, and then you start thinking all sorts of interesting thoughts. So what you're seeing here is in several different courses. These are online courses, so that it's very easy to look at data and see what students are doing. What's plotted here is performance. Each line here is a different student. What's plotted here is performance. And then opportunity here is the number of times, opportunity here means a student actually doing a task, right, that is supposed to be teaching or assessing in a formative way what they're learning, right? So opportunity to learn, essentially. And what you see here is really striking in these are very quantitative courses, so it's very easy to analyze it. But what you see here that's really interesting is students come in with a big range in performance initially, as if you've taught at certainly a big state university, you've seen that. But regardless of where students come in, they increase their performance at the same rate as a function of their opportunities. Just say that again. The students' learning increases at the same rate as a function of opportunity, regardless of where they came in. Now, I found this striking because many of us who teach have this intuition, which is wrong, right? That somehow the students who come in who are quote unquote better students are better students, right? They're going to learn faster, right? Well, the data show that's actually not true. What the students who come in who are better students have simply had more opportunities before they got to you, right? And they're going to progress at about the same rate as the students who came to you who didn't have those opportunities. You're giving them whatever opportunity you can. And so this has big implications, right? So when we're selecting students based on who's best, we're probably throwing out pretty much all the students who we're not selecting are probably just as good if given the opportunities. So this has all sorts of implications for what we should be doing before students get to college. It has all sorts of implications for how we should be structuring our teaching experiences in college. I'm in higher ed, so I think a lot about college teaching, right? So a lecture with some problem sets that are optional and 3 midterms, there's very little opportunity to learn there, right? So the students are going to do well. Of course, the students who've already learned a lot, they come in knowing a lot. You've kind of optimized the course for those students. One of the things technology does is it lets you do create a lot more opportunities for learning, because of course an opportunity for learning requires feedback. And feedback is difficult to give if you're doing it personally, if you're at a scale of hundreds of students in a big class, right? But technology lets you automate some of that and lets you give students many more opportunities. So as you can already tell, I'm kind of a fan of finding smart ways to use technology in learning. So that's very powerful. One other thing that this is not from learning sciences, this is coming out of communication sciences, which is kind of adjacent, but I think is really important. Some of you who are in the climate world have seen this sort of data before. You might know Dan Kahan's name. Dan's a social psychologist at Yale. So he's focused a lot on climate communication. Here, I'm not going to focus on climate, but on another data set of his. You're seeing probability of correct answer to this question. Human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals, true or false? And this is a survey done with about 1,000 people. And the y-axis here, what is this? What is ordinary science intelligence? This is essentially an instrument that Kahan constructed to measure science literacy, essentially. So basic science literacy, small number of items that the folks answer, and then you can sort of put them on a scale here of their quote unquote science intelligence. I don't like that term, science intelligence. It seems to me a little snarky, but their science literacy essentially. And what's plotted here are in this study, they also survey people to understand, to be able to quantify their religiosity. And what you see here is that you might expect, and as science educators, we have this conceit that if we just teach people science better, they'll all come to convergence in answering a question like this. And the data says, no, that's not true. In fact, to some extent, it's the opposite. The polarization increases as people become more science savvy in general. In this case, it's mostly because of this group going up. There's a slight downward trend here. In some other examples, Dan shows, you get real splits. Because of motivated reasoning, probably. Now you might say, well, okay, yeah, so their science literacy is high here, but maybe they just don't understand evolution, right? Well, no, that's not it, because you can actually change the question and get different results. If instead of asking just a question like this, you put at the front, according to the theory of evolution, human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. Now everybody agrees, more or less. Right. So it's not that the folks who have above average religiosity don't understand the science. They understand it very well. They understand what the science says, but for whatever reason, they don't accept it. And I'm not here to slag on religion at all. I go to synagogue, not all the time, but regularly. There's a spiritual side to things that I think is really important. And I'm not here to say what people should believe or not believe at all. But if we're talking about trying to manage the planet, and we're talking about saying that, well, if we just teach people science, we'll all come together and understand how to do it. That's naive. Because what shapes our beliefs and beliefs shape action is not just our knowledge, it's other things. And so when we teach, when we educate, we need to be aware of that, and we need to be responsive to that. Sagan, of course, said this in his own way. Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking. If we teach science as just a body of knowledge, people can understand that body of knowledge very well, but that doesn't mean they're going to agree with you because they aren't necessarily applying it through a scientific way of thinking. So we need to teach people, nurture scientific reasoning and not just the ability to understand science knowledge. We need to be able to teach people how to work with science knowledge. So in our center, right, everything we do, which is all digital, but we start with this kind of philosophy we call the education through exploration model, where we try to develop learning experiences that start by sparking the learner's curiosity, because that's the heart of science investigation, right? You got a question, something you want to figure out. Curiosity then leads to exploration, which is kind of a nice word for structured examination of what it is you don't understand. In science, exploration means collecting data, formulating a hypothesis, getting more data to test the hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. That's a form of exploration. Other domains, it's a little bit different. Exploration should lead to discovery, to that insight, that moment that Sagan mentioned in that other quote, that really then sinks in, cements in the knowledge that's gained, and then ideally leads to more curiosity. And so this is then not just teaching them knowledge, it's teaching the way to think and approach the knowledge in a way that is kind of constructivist, where the student's constructing their own learning. And learning the patterns of thought of science. Now, how do we do that? Well, we don't do it this way. This is not how we do it, right? Most higher education is this. It's especially for introductory courses that students fail in. That's just bad, right? So I'm here to tell you that technology can help. You might ask, well, how does this help? Especially post-COVID, right? We all went to this online learning and it sucked, right? So what am I talking about, championing digital learning? So what I will say is that, yeah, a lot of the online learning during COVID was pretty bad because it wasn't being done in a particularly thoughtful way to take advantage of the medium of using a computer to teach. This is just a digital lecture, essentially, right? This is taking passive learning that we're doing right now, slapping online and saying, hey, here you go. You're online, you're digital. Using technology. Well, yeah, we aren't taking advantage of technology. So tale of two technologies, right? It's really interesting. In education technology, for the most part, what we've done is replicated the passive learning experience with some details changes. Meanwhile, in the entertainment technology world, it's vibrant and full of all sorts of rich interactivity and adaptivity, right? And if any of you are video gamers, I won't ask you to raise your hands because in this audience, probably a lot of you won't be too embarrassed to raise your hands, but a lot of you are probably video gamers, right? You're immersed in these worlds where you learn an intense amount, right? Not about the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, right? You're not learning anything that's particularly useful to managing the planet, but you're learning, right? These are systems these are technology systems that are wired and geared to motivate you and get you to learn certain things, just not what we want to learn, to be teaching people in STEM education. So what we're trying to do in our center is leverage some of the things from that. So one part of that from that world. So one part of that is just the immersivity and engagement. So we develop virtual field trips. This is the Grand Canyon using spherical imagery. This isn't VR. VR can't scale yet. So we're doing things that we can deliver on the web. So these are 360-degree spherical images. This kind of technology is now used in real estate. Gigapan images, which some of you may have seen. These are just amazing, right? You can sit on one side of the canyon and zoom across. This is basically stitching together 1,000 megapixel images into a single gigapixel image. So you can create these experiences that really give you this kind of you are there, that sense that motivates people then to want to learn more, right? So you've sparked that curiosity with the right kind of technology. And virtual field trips are one way to do this. Interactive simulations that are well designed with good user interfaces is another. Things that make you want to touch and manipulate and figure things out. Technology is great for that. Lectures are really bad. But then that's not good enough, right? Because, okay, so I'm curious, now what? Now I want structured exploration. Well, now you need to put a student in a situation where they have to make decisions and get feedback. And so now we're in the world of tutoring systems. And conceptually, they're very simple, right? You put a student in a situation in that kind of environment where they have to make a decision. And then based on their answer to that decision, based on what they decide, you have a system that determines whether or not they need tutoring, whether they get it or not, right? If they do, then there's a system underneath that actually provides feedbacks or hints and lets the student try again. Conceptually very simple. And then once the student doesn't need further tutoring, now you go to another decision. And so on and so forth. We had a developer on our staff at one point who was a gamer, and he gave a little tutorial for us on gaming. And he asked us, what's a game? And we gave all sorts of answers. He said, no, game, it's basically, and from his standpoint, it's an interesting series of choices and decisions that you have to make that interest and motivate you to want to do more. That's a game. Well, that's a learning experience too, if the game is set up right. So this is what we try to do, is we try to take that really engaging kind of experience like a virtual field trip and put behind it adaptive learning. And then we end up with things like this. So this is a very simple thing, but just to get the point across. So here you're at Gubbio, Italy. This is the outcrop where the iridium layer was first discovered that signifies a meteorite impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It's just a road cut. And we have the student go there, but then we have them pick a sort of semi-fictitious chemical X-ray tool that allows them at the outcrop to measure the elemental composition as well as the mineralogical composition, and have them try to discover what's going on. They're prompted with questions, right? So first question here is, what period of time is different than the other periods of time? And often students will just guess. They don't want to do the work. Well, they can't get by if they just guess. They get feedback here that says, no, that's wrong. Look again. So now the student realizes that they missed a point. So they go back and they find the iridium anomaly. It's like, oh, there's something different here. Now they answer correctly, and now they move forward. This is a very simple, set of choices and feedback, but it's just to show you how you can, in very simple ways, start to build things that are kind of interesting that get the students to have to explore and answer questions. And this is a part of an hour-long experience that eventually has them calculating the size of the meteorite that must have hit in order to give the amount of iridium that you see at the iridium anomaly at the KT boundary. KPG boundary is the accepted term now. So if that interests you, we with NASA funding, we have a site, infiniscope.org. That has a whole host of these. We've learned how to do this pretty well. This is now being built out on an open source platform. We just finished a heroic transition from a proprietary to an open source platform so that we kind of control our own destiny now and can do things with other people. So if this interests you and you want to get into this, send me a note. Go to Infiniscope first and send me a note. The Taurus platform that's mentioned down here is a collaborative platform developed between us and Carnegie Mellon University to do these sorts of things that I'm showing you. And I'm privileged to be at a place like ASU that is really, despite being arguably the largest university in the country, depends how you count, we'd say we are, incredibly innovative and trying to really push this out. So we have a whole course here as part of ASU's Universal Learner course. These are courses available to anybody for $25. You can take a course. If you do well in it, you can pay a few $100 and get college credit. So we have this course called Habitable Worlds that we developed out of our center. That is an entire course taught in this way, a fully online course. The semester's worth. It's a general science course for non-science majors that teaches ostensibly about search for life in the universe. It's really teaching you, we hope, teaching you about scientific thinking, all through this kind of interactive digital experiences. And then the ASU is pushing the boundaries of what education through exploration means, with trying to figure out how we use VR in learning effectively. So there's a whole thing going on. It's not my thing, but there's a whole, they took our label, education through exploration. There's this whole VR effort at ASU called Dreamscape. That's very exciting. So revolutions are coming here where we're applying the lessons of learning science into technological systems that we can engineer to try to maximize outcomes for the purpose of enhancing STEM outcomes. And so I just want to conclude here. I want to return to my favorite image, just wrap things up. I realize I've gone a little long. And I want to go back to this, like literally my favorite image of this pale blue dot, right? And I just want to share this thought with you to conclude. We live at a remarkable moment in time. I mean, because through science, we are learning about the past of that pale blue dot. We're learning about its uniqueness, and we're learning about its possible futures. We're learning where we come from. We're learning where we stand, and we're learning more and more about who we are. That's the learning science part of it and what makes us tick. And so I've convinced you these things aren't disconnected. We don't quite know how they connect, but there's some sort of science that's emerging at the intersection of these questions. It has different facets and components, but there's something connected here. It's a science of how planets like ours evolve as integrated, holistic systems that include us as part of the system. This is not a system that we are studying from the outside. It's a system we are studying from the inside. We are part of it. Our future is its future. And this is a science of living worlds. And so with that, thank you. I'm glad to take any questions. What do we do now?
Yes. So
I can run get your lunch.
right. I'll just say, yeah, we realize this is lunchtime. There's a lot going on, but we do have time, and we even have someone ready to ask a question. We have, it looks like just one microphone. If you can use it, that's ideal, because there are quite a few people watching online and with us as well. So thank you very, very much, Ariel. That was fantastic. And I took a lot of notes to think about later. So I want to just turn it over to people who would like to ask questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This was deeply
Sure.
inspiring.
Thank you.
And a joy to listen to. Therese Moretto-Jorgensen, I'm from NASA Ames. I have a question about it's so intuitive that your new learning through exploration, how that works and how that will do better in education. But how do you see that closing this agreement gap? I mean, what does that take? Will this help with that too? Or what else do we need to do?
I mean, look, I think that agreement gap is partly, this has to do with values. And I don't think science education is going to change people's values, but I think a scientific way of thinking, my thesis is a scientific way of thinking includes being curious about other people's perspectives, and so leads to at least dialogue. Respectful dialogue that can lead to learning and convergence, right? I think most of us have probably seen that in different ways in our lives. So I think it's intuitively true. I think, we're a long way from proving that. I mean, the work I showed you of Kahan's is like, there's not that much, there's a small number of people studying that sort of thing. No one has yet gone and tried it, and we're still building our systems, right? But I would assert to you that if we can put students through curricula, not just a course or an experience, it has to be extensive, but I suspect a student going through several years of a curriculum that is teaching science in that way probably becomes more inquisitive, especially if they're younger, right? Becomes more inquisitive and willing to entertain ideas that are different than what they have learned from other sources. What's that?
So this is going to be more of a comment and shameless plug. I'm the Secretary Treasurer for the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, NAGT. I would encourage folks who are interested in education, which was an excellent discussion you had here, to visit our booth. And we also publish the Journal of Geoscience Education. So it's a discipline-based education research journal where you can find out a lot more about the kind of work that's being done here, and how best to reach students and find more peer-reviewed studies on what people are doing in geoscience education. So I really appreciate that portion of your talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate I've learned from folks in NAGT and geoscience education. Steve Semken, who you probably know at ASU, right, is a kind of mentor of mine in this space. So
this is a topic I don't really know much about, but I had a question about the difficulty in implementing interactive and active learning. For example, let's say we find ourselves with only 1 or 2 hours to develop our hour lecture session or whatever it might be, which is clearly not enough to do it well. Is there any research on the effectiveness of active learning done poorly versus lecture-based learning done poorly?
Yeah. So first of all, I feel your pain. I mean, I had to teach an environmental chemistry class this fall that I wasn't planning to teach originally, that I last taught 5 years ago, and I have a whole bunch of other stuff going on in my life. And even though I talk a good game and I spent a lot of my time doing the center, in the end, what did I do? I lectured most of the time, and I tried to tweak it a little bit. I had the students do group work and presentations, and I get the evaluations at the end, and I have students telling me, we wish we'd had more lectures. It's like, so probably I did the active. Well, so a few things. So first of all, assessing whether active learning is working well or not is an interesting challenge, because asking the students is often not the right thing to do, because students are often not fully aware of their own learning, and active learning is harder in some ways. I don't know if you guys, again, in my professional life, I'm part of various sorts of workshops at various times, and there's times where I just want to sit there and listen, right? And I don't want to have to talk to people next to me. I don't want to have to do some kind of structured activity. And I groan sometimes, right? But when I do it, I know I get more out of it, right? I'm metacognitive enough to know I get more out of it than just sitting and listening, right? Because I'm not doing my emails. I'm actually interacting, talking about the subject and doing something. So similarly with students. So that's one part of it. As to your question about, you're essentially asking me, can active learning be done badly? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And there is some research around that. I'm not deeply I can't quote you papers, but absolutely. So like any other push in reform push, right? The concept may be good, and there may be great examples of it being done well, but that doesn't mean that just doing it necessarily leads to good results. So there is a fair amount of conversation around that and literature around that. And anytime you hear about active learning and having positive effects, that's always active learning done effectively, done well by definition, right? So the thesis you should have is not that active learning necessarily is better. It's that active learning, when done well, leads to better outcomes than passive learning that's of comparable material, right? So, this has implications for institutional leaders, right? So if you're going to try to push your faculty, your teachers to do more active learning, you've got to resource them with the time and outside resources to be able to do it well. Otherwise, you may be actually doing harm.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I had a question because I love the visual connection and the intellectual connection between the two parts of your talk.
Mhm.
And I just wondered if there's a learning exchange between how are people studying other planets who are kind of studying them in the way that your interactive tutorial was, I think.
Yeah.
Is there learning about how, say, NASA scientists are learning from their data and exploring Mars, and how you're developing this, or vice versa?
Yeah, I'm not aware of
Just-
research that's about
okay.
that specifically, but it's an interesting
Yeah.
question. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because of my domain expertise, a lot of my teaching focus is around Earth and space sciences, and especially astrobiology. But what I'm trying, and the team is trying to apply more general principles, and we hope that the things we're learning are more general, right? So we haven't asked that question quite that way, but it's a good question. Anything else?
Owen, come on in.
Yeah, I think you made a compelling case for AGU to have a new section on the science of living worlds.
Thanks. I'll ask you to co-convene it, I guess.
Well, I'd say we do have time for one or two more questions, and maybe there are people here who are on the student side of this equation or just curious about anything you heard.
Uh-oh, Chris is gonna ask me a question I can't answer.
You talked about the aerobic biosphere. Is there any interesting speculation about what anaerobic, what a planet that never developed aerobic biosphere looks like? Is the kinetics just such that it's not that interesting, or?
No, it's yeah. So the question is, what about anaerobic worlds? So what about anaerobic biospheres? Yeah, no, there's definitely thought about how one would detect life on an anaerobic world. I mean, you still have organisms that are producing gases, right, that are detectable in theory. And so, yeah, that is an area of active research. The focus is on, I didn't talk about this here, but the focus is so much on aerobic worlds, partly because that's ours, but also because oxygen is something that we can relatively, if it's in high abundance, we can relatively, compared to other things, easily detect telescopically. And we can argue about, there are non-biological ways to get a lot of oxygen under certain circumstances, but we can kind of define and rule those out. We know the processes that can lead to non-biological oxygen in the atmosphere. So and they tend to have to do with photochemistry, so we can understand stars and determine whether a planet is a false positive. And so oxygen is kind of this nice one in that if you see it and you can rule it out as a false positive, you probably got something, and it's relatively detectable. So that's, I think, a large part of the reason there's such an obsession around oxygen, in addition to the fact, of course, that we kind of love it. The anaerobic signatures that I'm aware of, biosphere signatures I'm aware of, are not as easy to interpret.
Great.
Methane,
Great. Come on up.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk. This was so amazing.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk back to ask you about one of your examples, the interventions for inclusion. So in your slides, you talked about kind of the international gap, but I want to know, in your program for the education through exploration, how are you kind of attacking the national gap between, minority groups,
Yeah.
and, the basic group, I guess, of scientists and science research?
Yeah. So, it's a great question. So first of all, the hope is that the lessons learned from, and it's not my research, but the lessons learned from that international study apply elsewhere. And there is certainly evidence that that's the case. But where my thoughts go with that question is we have another project that's not in the Earth and space domain. It's in chemistry. We have an ongoing project now funded by the Gates Foundation that is all about trying to develop a general chemistry courseware suite designed specifically to try to produce more equitable outcomes. And so we're doing two major things there. One is innovating on the technology side to try to create more and better opportunities for students to interact with each other and help each other. That there's research that shows that that's kind of key for students to feel belonging, and also peers can help each other. And what we're doing is something that is actually very simple once you see it, but it took us a while to get to, and nobody seems to have done it yet, which is, if you've taken an online course, a science course, so there's probably a discussion board somewhere, right? And discussion board probably stinks in terms of its interactivity, and it's like a totally separate system. So what if you did something like very simple? You've got your course that your screen or your course material you're going through. And what if the discussion is like right there alongside? So that in the context of what you're learning, you can ask questions and get answers. And students can leave messages and hints or whatever for each other, right? Something as simple as that, when we've done a little bit of user research, something as simple as that, we think will make a profound difference for everybody. And this is a general thesis that I've learned. It's part of this sort of universal design concept that you design things that are going to universally help everybody, but disproportionately help those who are coming in with greater needs, right? And so that's an example, right? So the student who needs help, make it easier to get help. The student who's having a hard time connecting, the help they're getting from somebody to the content, bring it all together, right? So we're doing that on the technological side, and then on the curricular side, part of the problem with Gen Chem is it's a fire hose of material, and it's very abstract to most students. It's like, well, why am I learning this? And then when it's so teachers try to address that by saying, well, here's an example of why you should care. But the example is clearly supplemental, right? It's like, you're not tested on the example. And the example is clearly not primary in the teacher's mind, so it's not going to be primary in your mind. So what we're trying to do is have a layer in this curriculum. I mean, a lot of it is just going to be straight Gen Chem because for a bunch of reasons we have to include that. But there's going to be a layer of material that we're calling it's sort of the relevance section of the course. We're going to organize it around environmental and sustainable chemistry. And so we're linking key learning objectives in Gen Chem to things that students are going to be asked to try to figure out that are sort of real world relevant examples. So you're applying the knowledge. So part of the practice of part of the learning, right, where you're trying to apply these foundational things you've learned, is going to be in the context of these very relevant things that will be designed with simulations and things to make them intriguing, right? So those are the two things we're doing in that project to try to address this. So I hope that helps. We're also trying to create moments for this kind of self-reflection, and representation is kind of key to get that sense of belonging, right?
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting talk.
Thanks.
I'm especially interested in all the active learning stuff. And it seems like you even said you collaborated with like someone who did game development. So my question is, I guess game developers have already figured out a lot of this stuff. So is there more plans to incorporate them and collaborate with them more, or just get a team of them to work on this, or add game development courses as a requirement for teachers? Something like that. I don't know.
I would say this. There aren't plans. I think there should be. I think it's a fertile area to figure out and explore. I try to avoid using the word game because game implies to people, entertainment, right? And we're talking about teaching, and so it's not about entertainment. And also, there's one big distinction, which is that we've all probably experienced this. You often learn things the best when you really struggle with them, and that's often not fun. But then you have that breakthrough moment, right? And so there is some fundamental difference between the goal of a game developer, which, yeah, you may have moments that you're trying to frustrate the person, but ultimately you want to get them through, right? You want them to have a good time, right? Because it's that good time that gets you hooked, right? Teaching is a little different, right? And so we haven't had that dialogue enough. I think we should. So it's a good point.
So we have time for Four more questions, maybe keep the questions brief and answers
Oh, mine.
as you wish. Ariel, it's up to you, but
No, I'm
I
happy.
think we have time for everyone. So that's really nice.
Good,
Go.
thanks. Well, I look forward to your textbook when you finish writing it.
I'm sorry. You look forward to?
Your textbook when you finish writing it.
Oh yeah. Well, all right,
Yeah,
yeah. Got to figure out the table of contents
I'm going to
first.
follow up on that though. What would be your third chapter? What's the next thing you're going on?
Well, I think there's a lot of chapters in between the two here.
Well,
I think there's all sorts of stuff. I don't know. I honestly, I mean, the book metaphor occurred to
Love
me.
it.
She didn't. I previously talked to Margaret yesterday, and the book metaphor wasn't there. So the book metaphor is not even 24 hours old.
Great. Love it.
I needed something to kind of glue it all together, and I realized, oh, well, it's a science. So where's the textbook? Oh, there isn't one. All right, we're writing it.
I really like hearing about active learning and like implementing technology into that. And maybe this is kind of similar to a previous question, but how would you like think of including accessible learning into that? So like considering disabilities, say there's a student who is blind, like how would they be able to?
Yeah, super challenging. So first of all, I'll say, one of the values of virtual field trips is that it makes the quote unquote the field more accessible, right? There are students who cannot go on a field trip physically, right? So there's an accessibility there, just having the ability to have some kind of a simulation of the field experience through a virtual thing. For many things, that we do online, we make this technology screen reader capable, right? But there are some things you can't describe all that well. The technology does not yet exist to take something like a virtual field trip and have some kind of a spoken description that really brings it to life. I think it'll come, right? I don't know if you played it all with like Chat GPT. I mean, everybody's played with Chat GPT now, right? This online chatbot, right? Things are getting pretty sophisticated. So I can imagine in a 10-year horizon, maybe in a 5-year horizon, systems that can look at imagery and give you verbal descriptions of the imagery that are really accurate and vivid. So maybe that'll come. But I think the blind is the toughest one. You went right for the hardest one. So we've had, I've had students take my Habitable Worlds course, which is all through these simulations, who have certain kinds of learning disabilities, certain kinds of physical disabilities, and I get these very glowing responses that this is great. I didn't have to go to a lecture hall, and I could repeat things, and I could look at them really closely. I could zoom in, right, and very glad for that, right? So there are certain kinds of things that what we're doing now helps with. There's other things that are just, we just have to provide equivalent material.
6 minutes. So
Okay. All right. I can ramble forever,
Hi, Dr. Anbar. Great talk.
Thank you.
I am a postdoc at NASA Ames Research Center, and there are a number of postdocs in my cohort who are so passionate about the work that you are doing over at the Education for Exploration. Are there opportunities for folks who are education passionate, but maybe a little starved of opportunity? We're not at a typical university.
Yes,
where we
yes,
can-
there is. The
Awesome.
answer is, I'm going to point to Chris Mead back there to talk to Chris. There's a project that Chris is very involved in that I'm part of that is funded by NASA called SCOPE. I forget what SCOPE stands for, but it's all about connecting scientists like you with projects done by the NASA Science Activation Program, of which Infiniscope, the digital project we're doing, is one of them, right? And so there is a mechanism being set up. It's a new project that really has just gotten going, the SCOPE initiative, but it's supposed to become this sort of infrastructure to connect people like you with projects like ours. So talk to me afterwards, talk to Chris. If you've got a cohort of people who are interested, oh yeah, let's figure
I
it
got
out.
like 10 people to sign up.
Oh, that would be awesome.
thank you.
Not a question, Ariel, but are you willing to take this talk on the road? And we'd love to invite you to give this talk on campus.
I'd be glad to, Ron.
Great.
That'd be great. It needs some work, but thanks.
Sorry, I jumped in here, so I hope you still
That was the easiest question I've ever gotten.
You talked about the squishiness of both chapters essentially, and I really loved that. And as we move forward in science, it seems to be getting squishier and squishier. So I'm wondering if, like, in active learning, how you would implement with biogeosciences or harder sciences more of the social sciences, and if you have kind of implemented any way to introduce social sciences in those fields to help with learning.
To bring social sciences into geoscience teaching. I haven't done that personally. I mean, it's kind of implicitly done a little bit in parts of Habitable Worlds, because we want students to be a little metacognitive about their cognition and biases and stuff like that. If you're searching for life in the universe, you want to expose students to the notion that you can fool yourself, right? So there is a little bit of that kind of psychology early on in the course, but otherwise it's kind of a physicsy course. I think the challenge is that the reason we aren't doing that, as I reflect on your question, is because most of the teaching that we do is to meet particular curricular needs that are defined by a system that is not trying to do that. So except for kind of niche things, we don't do it. So and I see it now with this Gen Chem thing that we're doing, right? We would love, I mean, how exciting would it be to take Gen Chem in such a way that the social science relevance of chemistry, right, is part of the curriculum? I mean, how cool would that be, right? I mean, there's huge social justice issues in environmental chemistry, right? You could really bring these things together in humanities too, right? But the minute we start having those conversations with our Gen Chem faculty, who we love and are wonderful and are reform-minded faculty, right away it's like, okay, but what do we take out of the curriculum to make room for that? And we can't take anything out of the curriculum because the tests are this, and the articulation agreements between community colleges and universities require that we teach all this stuff. There's no room to bring in this other domain. And so we kind of get stuck. So we have a wicked systems problem in trying to really do this well in education.
And a bit of a follow-up. Do you think there's room for more courses that are these blended courses?
Yeah, certainly not at the intro level, but at the intro non-majors level and at a higher level for sure. But the bulk of education, right, where the change really has to happen, I think, is in that middle sort of massive majors intro courses. And those are locked in many ways.
Thank you.
Which kind of why we need a new science, new domains.
Awesome. You want to just
So that's it. I'm happy to call it a day. Whatever you want.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Let's give him a big hand. Great.
Thank you very much.
And an invitation to Berkeley. And I bet you'll find some others.
All right. Thanks. Thanks very much.